So we're on chapter 27, Foreign Policies of the Cold War. In the last chapter, we talked about domestic problems and got into a little of the foreign policies, but now we're going to get more in depth. We're going to talk about the foreign policies all the way from Truman to Jimmy Carter. So we're going to go back to Truman. So we're going to go through these and see exactly what happened during this period of history in America that we were affected by the Cold War of the communist threat. The communist threat is a global one. Its successful advance in one sector threatens the destruction of every other sector. You cannot appease or otherwise surrender to communism in Asia without simultaneously undermining our effort to halt its advance in Europe. Douglas MacArthur. I liked what he said right there, in that this communist threat is basically ongoing into these countries of the communist bloc. And he said you can't appease one, because you try to appease one, then you have to appease the other. And also, Douglas MacArthur said before that the only answer is to have a rejuvenation or a rebirth of faith. And so with him, he saw that the spiritual darkness of communism was in itself showing us that they basically needed to know the Lord Jesus Christ. He believed in evangelism, and so do I. As we go into the areas of communism and how dark it was, for one thing, we know they were atheistic and humanistic, and also, I should say, basically supporting evolution and all these things of communism, going back to Karl Marx, of course. And we see they did not allow Christians to evangelize. They did not allow the evangelization or the gospel to go out. So you can see right there shows us, and any ideology that doesn't, we have to admit, basically is not of the Lord. So especially when we look at communism in its roots and its pragmatism, basically saying, that the end justifies the means, and that is very satanic. So anyway, let's begin, and we'll get into the foreign policies of the Cold War. So here we have some pictures. Of course, we're going to get involved in Kennedy, his stance on the Cold War. Here's Nixon's stance on the Cold War and we're going to deal with these communist leaders from Vladimir Lenin all the way to Mikhail Gorbachev here. So we have Brezhnev and Khrushchev being very instrumental, and we'll see, in the midst of the Cold War here. I like this picture here because it says it's almost like World War III in Asia. So when we get into Asia, probably in the next video though, we'll be talking about Vietnam and the Korea War, which were wars, and almost like World War III. And here we see we see MacArthur, and we basically will get into the U-2, which were spy planes that were shot down over Russia. So at least one we're going to talk about in this. So let's begin. Oh, I wanted to go over, well, never mind. You can see here in the picture here, you can see for the Warsaw Pact, you're going to see where communist nations, and then of the United States. So let's get into the Cold War. Greater challenges in foreign affairs with the Cold War between 1945 and 1991. That's the area of history that we're going to be talking about today. After World War II, countries began aligning themselves with the two remaining superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. So, First World were those aligned with the United States. Second World were those aligned with Soviet Union. And Third World were those that were not aligned with either one. So when you think of, I always thought Third War meant just the poorer nations, but no, first, that was the term. First World would be the United States. Second World, those aligned with Soviet Union. And the Third World would be those that have not been aligned at all. So here we have the definition. The United States stood as a bastion of freedom and attempted to stop the spread of communism. The Soviet Union implemented communist ideals. The Cold War was primarily a political war, but occasionally resulted in armed conflict. This made these years an uncertain time for the world. Many looked for a day when peace would finally come. So as we see here, the Cold War, and this time, you look over time, this is quite a few years here involved with the Cold War, and also just the threats of the atomic bomb, the threats of actually destroying the world during this time. So many looked like, oh, can we finally have peace? So we see here Europe after World War II and the spread of the communist regime. We see here Poland, Czechoslovakia, all these areas that had been actually taken over by the communist regime. These pictures. And you can see how close, if you look at the North Pole, how close Russia is with the United States, especially Alaska. We're very close. And we're going to talk about the Cold War and the bombs and the testing of nuclear weapons. Post-World War II, the Soviet aims and American response to communism. So after World War II, American and British leaders hoped to have friendly relationships between the Western world and Stalin's communist regime. They hoped that they would work out, but they were totally disappointed. The governments in Eastern Europe were seized and turned into Soviet satellites. The Soviet aims were diametrically opposed to Britain's aims of preserving the lifelines of her empire and America's commitment to preserve peace and protect democracy. Here we have a picture. This is the symbol of communism, even now, so the red century they call communism and the Cold War going on. So, when you talk about after World War II, Russia on the side of the Allies, and of course, Churchill, the British Prime Minister, he did not trust what Stalin was doing. And literally, Stalin, in taking over, most of Russia at that time, and Ukraine and such, had already starved, millions of people in his own country, and many deaths. Over 15 million people died in Russia as communism took over. So, and literally back then we didn't know that was totally going on, so, and now we would. Do we dare trust them? The government of the Soviet Union. The Soviet goals. What were their goals? Well, to surround the USSR with satellite nations to be exploited for economic and military gain. So they wanted to surround more nations and more nations to take over. It was kind of like an Antichrist type goal to control the world, but as they would surround Russia, especially so they could exploit these countries economically and use them as military buffers. So also another goal was to gain access in order to build bases upon water highways of commerce. So they wanted to build their bases, and if there was a water highway because of Russia, especially in the Middle East, they wanted to have a way that they could control the waterways or the travelways and their merchandise. So number 3 would be carry on the Imperial Russia policy of geographic expansion. So they wanted to expand communism. And most important, to extend the ideology of communism. So first of all, they wanted to expand their geographic expansion to make them bigger geographically. And second, they wanted to also extend the ideology of communism through the rest of the world, to make the whole world communist, and basically looking at evilness of the New World Empire with a leader, supposedly a leader. Well, what we see that in the Bible, what kind of leader that would be. When we look in the Bible, the Antichrist leader to come, and against communism was against the ideologies of Christianity for sure. Basically against Christianity at its core. In fact, the persecution of Christians and the persecution of Jews would happen at this time. Why did they persecute Jews? And you look into that. Why would Satan want to do that? Because he knows that Jesus is going to come back and sit on the throne of David. And we see that in the Bible. So of course, there'd be the persecution. And that's what anti-Semitism is. It's very occultish and demonic. So anyway, here's the Cold War summary again. How did they do it? They wanted to spread communism through espionage, arms race, and we'll see the NATO versus the Warsaw Pact. So we'll see all of these things going on as the United States has to fight, the spread of communism. So it says here, the history, Russia was transformed into the Soviet Union in 1917. This is way before we thought World War II. It was actually during World War I. And Vladimir Lenin led the Bolsheviks and overthrew the Tsarist regime at that time. The Tsars were like, kings at that time. And he was a follower of the Marxist doctrine of what? Karl Marx, right? Of social equality. And he believed the Communist Party, and he would like to spread the Communist Party to America. Here he says the goal of socialism is communism. He says, well, you don't just have democratic socialism. The goal is communism, he says. And he says atheism is the natural and inseparable part of communism. Atheism means he would not permit any religions at all except for atheism, no God, right? We know what the Bible says about that. A fool says in their heart there's no God. So he would be considered a fool according to the Bible. The Iron Curtain. In 1946, Winston Churchill spoke of an iron curtain of tyranny and oppression which descended on the nations of Eastern Europe. So Winston Churchill first spoke of this being like an iron curtain. Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and Yugoslavia were all influenced under this Iron Curtain. A lot of these countries were given, as Roosevelt prior to this had made the deals of Russia being able to get control of these countries and preserve control of these countries. And most of these countries were not totally willing to be under that control and were persecuted. When I think of especially Poland and Romania and what went on there, it's very atrocious what they basically putting them, into their own type of prison camps, and Christians being persecuted drastically. So whenever and wherever the communists seized power, multitudes of people were killed or imprisoned. Right there, whenever that happens, multitudes of people killed or imprisoned in all these countries, that's very satanic. The freedoms of religion, speech, and press were taken away. No freedom to speak, no freedoms to write what you want to write. No, they were taken away by the government. No freedoms of religion at all, except for the atheist religion of not believing in God. Communist ideals were soon seen as a threat by the West, as they finally looked and said, can we know what is going on in a lot of these countries under the Iron Curtain? Those Iron Curtain meant the communist-controlled countries. This man here, Bernard Baruch, he was an advisor to several presidents, and he warned Americans. I love what he said here, so I had to quote it. It says, "Let us not be deceived. We are today in the midst of a cold war. Our enemies are to be found abroad and at home. Let us never forget this. Our unrest is the heart of their success. So basically he's saying, yes, we're in the midst of a Cold War, and now our enemies are all over, even around, but even coming into the United States. The Communist Party and Socialist Party were present. Even in our government. But the most important is this, what I highlighted. Let us never forget this. Our unrest is the heart of their success. Say that again. Our unrest is the heart of their success. The first tactic of communism is to bring unrest to us, so that we are under all kinds of stress and unrest and chaos, and then they'll come in and take over. So we can see that throughout history. Communists use tactics as, first of all, getting the labor unions all worked up, to violence against their employers, to the point of total unrest, and a lot of them being communist instigators. We found that out in history. And now, of course, we see other things. We'll see even today the unrest. Now, I'm not saying it's by communists for socialism. Both it can be, but we can see how the enemy really wants unrest, even war. So basically to get people, to stand up as racism, to be anti-Semitic. We see that in the time that we are. We have persecution of Israel. We have persecution of races, and getting races mad at each other, and onto other inner things. Even to the point of very unusual tactics, but all aimed at unrest. So that's the tactic of communists. So when things are getting unrest and people are battling over issues, these issues have already been picked out to be brought to the political screen, so that we will battle each other. In that point, communism come up and say, hey, we'll fix this, Anyway, our unrest is the heart of their success. That's what they want to do, is bring unrest. That's very introspective, but it is true. Here's some pictures. These are of the Iron Curtain. This is especially of Berlin. As we see, the Berlin Wall will be put up here. So the Iron Curtain was, basically spoke of this Iron Curtain, in the physical, or in the spiritual sense too, but also in the physical sense. They literally put up walls to keep people in from getting out of their communist regimes. American response to communism and the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine. Let's find out what that was. Now we're starting with Truman because he's the one who went on World War II, and then he finds out, Stalin is not being truthful, and he's lying about these things. He's basically going to come in and take over these countries and not allow them to have free systems at all. And so he's realizing now what is going to come in the future as for in developing his doctrine, the Truman Doctrine. So President Truman's administration took steps to keep communism in check. In 1947, the British withdrew from Greece, which left Greece and Turkey wide open then to Soviet control. So the Soviets saw the Dardanelles, where Greek islands, Greece was, and Turkey, important to control. They had the Dardanelles between them, so they wanted that area, so then communism could move into the Mediterranean Sea. And this, of course, would also threaten the oil-rich Middle East. So to prevent a Soviet invasion, the Truman Doctrine then was announced. So in 1947, the United States would employ her resources to prevent the overthrow of any democracy through outside interference. Congress appropriated $400 million to aid Greece and Turkey and protect them from militarily against the communists. So basically what Truman said, now, okay, we have communism now coming into Greece and Turkey. So we need to put forth this doctrine, which Truman did. And still, the Truman Doctrine is, not only will the United States keep communism in a container, but the United States will also help countries around the world resist communism. This is known as the Truman Doctrine. Just remember, the Truman Doctrine has to do with resisting communism. And that's when he arranged for this $400 million to be sent to Turkey and Greece to help them against the spread of communism. So here we have the beginnings of the Cold War. The foreign aid and the Marshall Plan. So the Secretary of State, George Catlett Marshall, he lived 1880 to 1959, announced the European Recovery Program that was called the Marshall Plan. Just remember, the Marshall Plan is to help those countries to recover from World War II in Europe. The program extended $13.3 billion over the next 4 years. And this was to accelerate Western Europe's economy to help oppose the communist threat. So what he was doing, he's saying, as we help these countries basically able to help themselves to get on their feet, this will help them so they could oppose communism, which is true. So Truman also gave aid through his 4-point program, another way to give aid to Europe, and he sent in $34.5 million to give assistance to underdeveloped countries worldwide. The fourth point in Truman's inaugural address in 1949 was to do this and to assist underdeveloped countries so that they could stand on their feet and protect themselves from communism too. One of those ideologies was to do this. So the Marshall Plan was developed to help rebuild Europe after the war. That's what we know. Here's Marshall here. And the Marshall Plan gave economic aid to any nation that promised to resist communism and remain committed to democracy. So basically to give aid in that. So the Marshall Plan kind of went with the Truman Doctrine. We can say, although Truman and George Marshall did not agree on Israel, and when Truman recognized Israel as a nation, Marshall did not agree. Why do you think he didn't agree? Well, he knew as soon as Israel would declare its independence, and declare themselves a nation, he knew the surrounding Arab countries would attack. And indeed, they did attack. But God did miracles and protected. And we'll get into that later on, but God protected Israel during this time miraculously, through all the surrounding Arab nations that had attacked. So anyway, the Marshall Plan has to do with giving aid to Europe after World War II. NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. We even hear about NATO today when we're talking about Ukraine and Russia and everything. But what is NATO? Well, it's a treaty between North Atlantic countries in the North Atlantic. So we're talking about, Europe, right? And not only Europe, we're also going to be talking about the United States and Canada. So the United States, Canada, and 10 Western European nations signed a defense pact in April of 1949. You think 1949, after World War II. This established NATO and the security era in the North Atlantic and Western Europe. Basically, NATO provided for mutual defense and consultation, saying, okay, we need to stick together here. And basically, they were forming they need to stick together because they knew what was going on in Soviet Union, especially with Stalin, and overtaking some of these Eastern Bloc nations. And so NATO came together. Well, what's Russia or the Soviet Union going to think about this? They're going to have to form their own alliance, right? But anyway, it says, whenever the territorial integrity, political independence, or security of these parties is threatened NATO will come and be able to consult together in this whole group of nations and help each other. Truman strengthened Western European and Mediterranean defenses during this time too. The perimeter of NATO was expanded now to include Greece and Turkey. Remember, Greece had been threatened by the Soviet Union, and Turkey too. 6 United States Army divisions were stationed in Europe now, and Truman named General Dwight D. Eisenhower as Supreme Commander of NATO. So Eisenhower actually would be the next president after Truman, but he also was now the Supreme Commander of NATO, Eisenhower. So here you see, here's Eisenhower, here's the NATO sign here, and you can see this is the first organization, and you can see down here again, this is Eisenhower and the beginnings of NATO. NATO. The original members of NATO in 1949 were the United States, Italy, Iceland, United Kingdom, Canada, Portugal, France, Norway, Denmark, Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. So those are the beginning. And then the new members that came in is Greece and Turkey came in 1952, West Germany in 1955, Spain in 1982, the Czech Republic and Hungary and Poland, at this time came in 1999. That was actually after the fall of Russia, 1999. And Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia all came in 2004. Albania and Croatia in 2009, Montenegro and North Macedonia also in 2020. Now, after this whole 1999, we'll have a change in the communist regime as Russia falls. So these countries didn't come until later. In 1966, France did leave NATO, but remained part of its political structure, but then it fully rejoined in 2009. And the Mutual Defense Treaty was invoked in 2001. So what happens after we find out after the communist bloc nations are freedom? They come and joining NATO at this time. Ukraine too. So, okay. They no longer have ties to the counter-Soviet power, it says. Anyway, so onto the Warsaw Pact in 1955 to 1991. Of course, because, the countries of the West, they got together in defense against communism, then the communists thought basically they were going to make their own pact. So the Soviets denounced and countered NATO by forming the Warsaw Pact in 1955. And its original members were the Soviet Union, East Germany, Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, and Albania. All these countries later on would come away from that pact, that's for sure. And the new members, Mongolia, North Korea, Vietnam, and China, held observer status and attended organizational meetings. China did. So, of course, we have new communist countries coming in at that time. The former members of Albania and East Germany as they joined up till NATO. So, and the Mutual Defense Treaty was invoked in 1956, 1968, and 1981, and we'll see later on as Warsaw Pact is no more today, only to 1991. And we'll find out because in the next section, we'll find out about the fall of the Soviet Union. So the Soviets were afraid of an American attack once Germany built an army, so they made a military alliance with each other in the communist countries to defend against in case NATO would attack them. So here, we have this even going on today. So here we have a picture of the communist bloc, and we have those countries, that have joined in to NATO. So I think that's the last slide, and then we're going to get into more. We're going to go into the nuclear and disarmament and such in the next section.